All right, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the February 11th Policy Committee meeting. I want to welcome again our student and teacher representatives and fellow committee members who are getting situated, and our administrators and our solicitor. Dr. Stevenson, would you like to provide any administrative remarks for this evening?
Thank you, Chairperson Goldman. Good evening, members of the committee and the public. Tonight we would have several bills, certain policies before us that we will, some for second reading, some first reading, that we'll go through. Just want to update the committee and the public on one of the items that we talked about last week, and that was goals. The goals are in draft form, however, they're not complete. Therefore, I ask that the committee indulges that we table that presentation until next month, because I did not have a chance to discuss this with the committee leadership or have it vetted by Superintendent Batchelor. And so I want to have time to do that, and before we bring it before the committee. We plan to have it prepared and ready to discuss next month.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Stevenson. At this time, any public comment? Seeing none, we'll move to the approval of minutes. Is everybody okay with the minutes from last month? Okay. And we will move right into the first agenda item, which is 4.1, Policy 249, Bullying, which is before us for a second read today.
Yes, Policy 249, Bullying, is up for second read. It was passed from the first read from last month from the board, as the whole board, and therefore we asked the committee to agree to move it for the second read.
Okay, thank you very much, and no changes have been made since it came from the first read, so I'd like to just go around and see if anybody has some remaining concerns before we decide whether or not to move it forward at the business meeting. Avery, you're good? Yeah. Mrs. McMenamin?
No, I'm good. The questions have been answered.
No?
Good.
Everybody's good?
Yeah,
There was a last minute question that came up from the committee. I just want to put it out there, and that has to do with the definition of bullying, and in particular, the reference to bullying being at certain times a one-time act. So does our administrative liaison or solicitor want to address that?
Sure. So the definition of bullying does contemplate single act or multiple acts. As you'll see, the definition says that it can be a physical act or a series of acts, just like I said, and that does come directly from the code. So there are times, it's rare in day-to-day operations, but there are times where one single act could be considered an act of bullying. Generally, bullying is a pattern of behavior over a period of time. But the way that the school code is written is, depending on the severity of a single act, there could be a time where one single act could contemplate bullying under the policy.
So you're not necessarily required to classify it as an instructor, let's say, as an act of bullying if it's one act. That
Correct.
doesn't require you to do that. You could classify it as something else in terms of addressing it.
Correct.
Okay. Does that seem okay with everybody? That was a question that came up just prior to the meeting. No? Everybody's good? Okay. Well, then let's say that we will put this before the full board for adoption, second read and adoption at the end of the month. Thank you, everyone. And for the next item on the agenda, we have Policy 919, Civility, again, something up for a second read.
Yes, Policy 919 is up for a Civility is up for a second read. Was vetted by the full board and sent back to the committee with no changes. We ask that this committee moves on to the full board for a second read.
Dr. Stevenson, I just did want it's Policy 919, not 909, just for clarification, and I did want to just have you mention that in our version previously, under delegation of responsibility, remember there were 4 bullet points, one of which was removed for this read, that doesn't cause a substantive change?
Yes.
Okay, so I just want to point that out for the benefit of anybody who might have noticed from the previous version to this one, that in our policy planning meeting, the question came up about the fourth bullet point under delegation of responsibility, methods of communicating the contents of the policy and the accompanying administrative regulation to all students. That was something that was stipulated to be in the AR. It was removed. Sort of because these things do automatically go onto our website and are propagated that way, correct? So there's I'll wait for our experts to chime in anything further they might want to add to that.
So that final bullet point was taken out because it indicated that the administrative regulation would talk about a communication strategy for the policy, and that is not required by law. So we took that out because it wasn't addressed in the AR.
Okay, so I just wanted, in case somebody noticed that, I just wanted to make sure that was pointed out. So from there, does anybody have anything in this second read on civility that they have questions, concerns about before we move it on to the business meeting? Starting again, maybe Mrs. McMenamin, Liz? Susan? No? Okay. Well,
Can I make one other comment?
Sure.
On the AR, I believe that the version that's in the packet may not be the most up-to-date version, because I'm looking at, on page 2 of the AR, where there are 3 scenarios where there's a complaint and then a recommended response, and we took those examples out of policy 919 because we felt that the cross-reference policy 906, which we'll talk about in a moment, adequately outlined the steps that you would follow when making a complaint. So I just would like to point out that when the AR gets posted, those 3 examples, and if you look at the screen, you'll see what we propose to take out.
okay, great, thank you, because I think we discussed in planning also that
Yep.
sometimes if you're going to speak to a few, then there are always a few more, and where do you draw the line between giving examples? So that was kind of the reasoning behind that. So does anybody have any questions or concerns based on that update Ed's given us? No? Okay. Susan? And nope? Okay. Well then, thank you very much for pointing that out. Let's just make sure that one is posted correctly for the business meeting, okay? Just make an extra note of that. All right, let's move on to the next agenda item, which is policy 906, formal complaints, and that also is going for a second read potentially at the business meeting. Does anybody have any questions about 906, starting over with our student?
I did have one question that, like, being new to the policy board, under guidelines, it states that anonymous complaints will not be recognized in an official complaint, and I was curious to know, like, why that was.
Generally, it's hard to formally respond to an anonymous complaint. It doesn't necessarily mean that what's in, if someone submits an anonymous letter, it doesn't necessarily mean that it won't be looked into. But if there's no contact information or there's no way to get back to someone, we're not able to engage in the formal steps of walking someone through the process just because we don't know who they are. And that would be the reason why.
Good question, though.
Yep.
It's funny that, Avery, I'm glad you mentioned something, because it caught my eye. I think it says, therefore typically will not be given a response under this policy, right? I mean, an official complaint, an anonymous complaint, I guess it depends on how you define anonymous. So anonymous might mean I need to make an anonymous complaint, but the superintendent or whoever may know who the complainant is. Would that be a confidential complaint?
Yeah, that's what I was asking.
Right, so, I understand why an anonymous complaint can't be recognized as an official complaint. They are 2 completely different things, and this process outlines an official complaint. But I think, what occurred to me, and I think maybe what Avery was going, it's like, they don't necessarily get totally ignored. They just won't necessarily get a response under this policy. they may get a response of some sort.
Would it be more helpful to say typically will not be given a formal response?
I don't know what the right answer is. I could just imagine a scenario where we actually do have an anonymous complaint, and it does get some sort of response, depending on what the circumstance is. And yet, it would not come under this category, this policy, period, end of story, because this is about formal complaints. And I don't know what the answer is.
Yeah.
It occurred to me in the same way. And I guess and I don't want to get into the weeds in this policy about what constitutes an anonymous complaint, because this policy is about formal complaints, period, end of story. But I'm sure that we have had scenarios where people have come forth and said, I need to tell you this, but it needs to remain anonymous, blah, blah, blah. And depending on the circumstance, our superintendent or the administration has dealt with the situation in some fashion. I don't know what the answer is here for this policy.
And I would say in that case, that complaint, even though the complainant has asked to remain anonymous, that doesn't mean that that's an anonymous complaint.
Correct.
So I think what's contemplated in this sentence is truly an unsigned, letter that gets sent. We can add to the end of that sentence under this policy. I think that makes sense.
Is everybody do you hear where I'm going with that? Are you guys comfortable with what I'm saying?
Substance. It's anonymous, but the substance is worth looking into.
Correct, but it just wouldn't get dealt with under this policy,
Right.
whatever it is. I don't know, maybe we should kind of recap that with our superintendent.
May I ask if there is another policy which may address something of this nature?
Ed, couldn't you imagine that our policies, I'm imagining a scenario that would be one of the harassment or, discrimination. There's any number of other policies
Yep.
that would likely cover the scenario I'm speaking about, at least initially. Ken, I don't know if are you a little up to speed on what we were talking about? Okay.
We do point out in the policy that there are, the second to the last paragraph, special procedures provided for by law or other board policy for handling complaints in certain areas may exist, and we specifically call out like discrimination and unlawful harassment, so that if someone writes to us and says, I'm making a formal complaint under policy 906 and I'm alleging that I've been discriminated against, that gives the superintendent or designee the ability to say, that's actually not really a 906 complaint, that's a policy, whatever the policy is, type of complaint, and we'll follow the procedure in that policy. So my guess is that likely there is another policy that would address, but it would really depend on what the subject matter of the complaint was. But most likely the answer to that question is yes, because we do have policies on discrimination, on unlawful harassment,
Right.
All of those types of things that apply to employees, students, job applicants, all of those folks.
Okay, so how, Susan, are you feeling about that? If we were to take Ed's suggestion
And just add under this policy.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that was my initial suggestion,
Okay.
is that we just, it gives the impression that we wouldn't give any response. And Ken, as I was saying when you were out the room, I could imagine a scenario where someone comes forth to you or to an administrator and says, I need to make an anonymous complaint. You would, depending on the situation, you would respond and deal with it. So I don't want to leave, but not under this policy. It would be in your good judgment and with all the, depending on the circumstance. So does that create a problem to just say under this policy?
No, I think Ed proposed that. He
Okay,
sort
great.
of-
So, yes, I would like to say that we just add to the end of the sentence. And it still keeps it as a first read. It doesn't change it, because we would be putting it forth to the board as a first read with the words, under this policy.
No, this is a second read.
Oh, formal complaints?
Yes.
And that's fine.
Oh.
It's not a
That's not
substantive.
substantive, okay. Oh, I'm confusing with the next one, sorry.
Okay, so, Susan,
yes,
do you
I
have
would.
any other,
Not on that policy.
and I want to make sure, I've lost track, Jeff and
No,
Liz.
I think it addressed.
Okay, the one thing I wanted to raise is that in public comment, last month, when we were discussing this, it was raised, could coaches be considered part of the people to whom this policy applies, have that stated, but I don't know if they're classified as employees, in which case they would fall under another policy. But I did want to address that because it was raised in public comment.
They would be covered under the employment policies, because they are paid by the
Right,
district.
paid by the district, so, okay. All right, so then I think, and everybody's had a chance to see the AR, right? So you have another couple weeks to look at that. That doesn't have to be formally approved, but I just want to make sure, because it wasn't posted with the rest of the materials, that everyone's aware that there is a developed AR around this. If you have any questions about that, let us know. But if this policy is approved for adoption at the business meeting, the AR will, and the policy will go up right after that. So if you have any questions, please let us know sooner rather than later about the AR. Okay? Sound good? All right, so let's move that one along and move on to our next item on the agenda, which is Policy 202, Eligibility of Non-Resident Students. This is back again for a first read. We had worked on this some time ago, not too long ago, and perhaps a little background on why it came back so quickly would be helpful to the committee.
Yes, so this policy is coming back for clarification regarding the exception. As a general matter, individuals that are entitled to come to school in Radnor are Radnor residents. But there's Policy 202, which talks about scenarios where sometimes non-resident students do have an entitlement, either under law or under board policy, to come to Radnor. And one of the discretionary reasons for which the board has decided to allow non-resident students to come to Radnor is when you're a former student. And generally, when you're a former student, if you qualify under the board policy to remain in Radnor schools after you move out of the township, you would pay tuition. However, there is an exception for, and there always was an exception for students who are seniors. Basically, they move out of the township after the completion of their junior year, and they would be able to stay at Radnor High School tuition-free for their senior year. We wanted to clarify, and this was a request from Mr. Bechtold, that we clarify that that exception applies for 1 year only. So if somebody comes, they're a junior, then they move out of the township and they come back for their senior year and they fail their senior year, we're not going to continue to educate students year after year. There are times when students, based on the number of credits they have, will be considered seniors for multiple years. And so we wanted to clarify, and it's consistent with what a lot of other school districts in the, or a number of school districts at least in the area do. This entitlement is for 1 year only, and it only applies to students that are attending Radnor High School. So if a student is placed by the district or by the court or by anyone else with authority to place students in an educational placement, if they're placed in another location, this policy doesn't necessarily mean that Radnor is committing to fund third-party placements for non-resident students. The whole reason that we have this exception is to maintain stability for a student at their existing school, Radnor High School. If the court orders a student placed at a third-party site and that family moves out of the township, wherever they move, that entity, that school district where they're then residing, is then responsible financially to educate that student. They're going to continue at their same school regardless of whether Radnor pays or whether the new school district pays. So those two clarifications were just helpful to put into the policy, that it has to be a Radnor High School student and that senior year is meant to be 1 year only.
Okay, thank you. Does that help? I'll make my way around the table, but start with our student again.
Yeah, that helps to clarify that. Thank you.
Okay. Teacher representative, yes, okay. Yes. Jeff, did you have?
I just want a quick clarification question. I'm looking at the, I guess where the change was made. If you're looking at the red line, former residents, second paragraph. So the bottom of page 2, if you will, on board docs. maybe it's just the way it's written, this entitlement shall apply, and maybe that you just, this is what you meant, only to the school year immediately following the student's junior year at Radnor High, and shall not extend beyond the last day of the school year immediate following the student's junior. I'm struggling with understanding it. Is that what you just said?
Yes.
But this is just the way it's written? Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
And if we need to clarify that, we can.
No, maybe it's just me.
No, I think the question is, what's the value of the last
I
part
don't
of that
get it.
sentence? Why doesn't it just end with, this entitlement shall apply only to the school year immediately following the student's junior year at Radnor High School, period? Why,
It could end right there.
Okay.
Yep,
and it says,
Yeah,
the
we
same-
have no-
there's nothing additional in that.
correct. We can delete
Is that what you were talking
Yeah,
about, Jeff?
yes, I was. I just didn't understand what it meant. I've been clear we're on the same page.
I think it sounds like they want to make sure that if the school year runs longer, or you need an extra month or two, that it really has to end.
Okay.
I don't know if I'm right about this, but it really has to end concurrent with the last day of the school year and can't even extend a month
Oh,
or so
wait,
beyond.
is that about
Is that-
ESY? Or extend, if we have delayed school year, I don't know.
ESY would be included anyway.
Okay.
Because you
The
wouldn't,
academic year.
you would, for a 12th grade student, you wouldn't make them go somewhere else for ESY. So I actually think that it actually makes sense, I think, to cut the sentence short.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, so it'll end after junior year. All right. And let's see, there is for this, Susan, did you have any questions?
On this one, no.
Okay,
No.
all right. And there's an accompanying AR. Hopefully everybody's had a chance to read that too. So is everybody comfortable at this point with it going forward for a first read? No?
Yeah, I was just curious about, this is common. Okay, this is common among school districts across Pennsylvania, or these,
Yes.
okay.
Yes.
This learnings, okay. Yeah. I was guess how prevalent, or even how prevalent this even occurred. Yeah.
It's not very common to have a family that moves out when a student is a senior. So the policy only comes into play rather infrequently, and then it's significantly rarer that it would be a student that would be here for multiple years in 12th grade anyway. It doesn't happen very often, but we just want to be crystal clear as to what our approach would be.
Actually,
And
I would have thought, I'm sorry, Ken. I just would have thought that the part that's more common is our families in lower grades, not senior year, but that they move. And
Correct.
in order to stay in Radnor for the rest of the school year, you have to be moving out after the start of the second semester. You can't be in here for September and October and then stay in Radnor, move to some other town and then stay in Radnor for the year. You have to be still a resident as of the second semester. That's probably more common with just families moving in or out, yes, no?
I wasn't gonna speak to that one, but I was gonna speak more to the senior piece, that's common. I mean, I've been in districts where you had to be it was a little different. You had to be enrolled one day of your senior year if you'd been there junior year, and you could stay if your family moved. You know, but
This
so you
is
had.
more generous.
So this is more generous. This is more generous than that, yeah.
Okay, so does that, everybody comfortable with this moving forward for a first read now? Yes, head nods? Okay. All right, terrific, let's move that forward. And we now have 3 policies that are in front of us, first reads towards repeals. First one is Policy 142, Migrant Students.
Yes, as you said, Chairperson Goldman, this is the first of 3 repeals. Migrant students, the reason why we are saying that this is repealed is that PDE now administers this program, and it's not a necessary policy for us to use. Therefore, we ask that it is recommended to be repealed as a first reading in our next board meeting.
Okay, does anybody have any concerns, questions about this repeal? Liz? Nope. Jeff? Susan?
No.
Okay, great, let's move that forward for a first read for repeal. And the second one, Policy 143, Standards for Consistently Dangerous Schools.
Again, we bring this up to, for your consideration, is because it is a district level policy is not necessary, and therefore we are recommending that this be rescinded and repealed for first reading.
Okay, does anybody have any questions? And just make note, I appreciate the efforts of Mr. Diazio and Dr. Stevenson to put rationales for each thing when you look closely at the agenda. So it's not that we can't elaborate further, but that's meant to give you the why of our work prior to coming into the meeting. So is anybody, Susan, you good with moving forward too?
I'm fine with it. I think what I just would like to point out is that, just based on the date, it appears that this was part of our group. The district adopted a boilerplate PSBA manual back in 2008. And so these, now that I'm seeing that the date adopted is March 25th, 2008, these policies they never really applied to us. They were just part of the package of policies that we got from PSBA when the board as a whole, they made the decision 12 years ago to, the way to deal with their outdated policies was to adopt the PSBA packet of policies as a whole. And then over time, with the intention of going through and updating, and that's, you know, what a lot of the work of the policy committee's been for the last 12 years. Now that I'm seeing the dates on these, I'm realizing they never applied to us. They just came with the boilerplate, and Ed and Dr. Stevenson in their diligence are weeding through and saying, we never did need these. So just context of why 3 all of a sudden.
And over the course of time with the policy committee, we've decided it's less maintenance. If we don't have these policies on the books, it's that much less to maintain. So if we don't need them, we remove them. It doesn't take that much of our time. Okay, and the last one, so let's move that one forward for first read towards repeal. And the last one that falls into this category is policy 144, standards for victims of violent crimes.
And the same rationale for 144 applies as was the case for 143.
Right. Okay, terrific. So, does anybody have any questions or concerns about repealing that one? Nope. Okay. All right, then we are through our agenda and we come to new business. Does anybody have any new business?
I just have a quick comment. Not just for clarity, because as I read more carefully through the part on the minutes for policy 249, either Dr. Stevenson or Amy, just when we're doing the final read of this, if we could just point out that we changed the name back to bullying. You know, that so if people are looking for the anti-bullying policy, it's not like we made that go away. This is it. We just went back to the original name of it. Because I'm not exactly seeing that was one of the things that we revised as part of the policy work.
You mean in the you want us to point that out in the description? of
Correct,
why
and
we're
then please note that one of the changes is, you know, the name change of back to bullying as opposed to anti-bullying.
Yeah, I remember I did that for when we brought it before the full board for a first read. If you'd
No,
like
we
me
can
to
do it again. Yep, just so
Okay.
it's kind of out there twice, and then
Okay.
that's it. Thank you.
All right, no problem. Okay, and so beyond that, for new business, anybody? No? Okay. And final public comment? Doesn't look like there is any, so we'll call this a wrap and see you all in March. Thank you.